Before we begin with the building process, let's check out a photo that the client provided. Then we'll head over to SketchUp and look at a 3D model of how the cases are put together. Let's go. This is the photo of the style of bookcase my client chose. We decided to forego the latter as these cases aren't going to be over 9 feet tall. The metal will have a rusty patina to maintain the rustic look of the piece, and the wood drawer fronts and the shelves will retain as much of the aged look as possible as well. Now let's look at the 3D model. SketchUp and other 3D design programs are great for planning out projects as they allow problems and solutions to appear without wasting material. Here we can see that the bottom case is quite taller than the case in the photo, so I am adding an additional drawer and shelf in the middle. The dimensions of the case are going to be 51 inches wide and an overall height of 90 inches, or 7.5 feet tall. The base case is 18 inches tall and 18 inches deep, and the upper case is 72 inches tall and 15 inches deep. Now let's look at the materials I'll be using. You might recognize this. It's a metal bed frame. You can pick them up at salvage yards or secondhand stores for pretty cheap, and they provide a fair amount of material for angle iron. You have to make sure though before you weld it that it's free of rust and paint in order to get a good weld. So I'll show you how I break that down now. I start by clamping each rail into a metal vise and cut away the rivets that hold the feet and extension rails into the main rail. Then, with the waste piece clamped into the vise, I pry the rail free. This is done on all the bed rails. The holes only add to the rustic look of the piece. I use a metal cutting bandsaw to cut all the metal to length. I use a square to make sure the blade is cutting perpendicular to the fence. Then set a stop to cut the foot to the appropriate length, clamp the stock to the fence, and let the saw do the work. Lubricating the workpiece with oil extends the life of the blade and makes for a cleaner cut. When all 16 feet have been cut, the ends need to be beveled with a grinder in preparation for welding to the frame. It's time to weld the base frames. I'll be using 1 inch by 1/8 inch angle iron, and I'm going to notch the ends to make each piece fit 90 degrees to each other. I start by marking the pieces with a soapstone and use a thin metal cutoff disc in the angle grinder to make the joint. The piece is clamped in a vise and the joint is cut to fit. While the piece is in the vise, I clean the joint and bevel the edge to prepare for the weld. I do this on all the frame pieces. Now that the pieces have been notched, it's time to go ahead and weld the small, short frame pieces right into the long frame pieces. With the base frames ready, I clamp the joining pieces together at the table, making sure the joints are square and flush. I'm using 035 self-shielded flux core wire to weld the frames. I start by tack welding opposing corners in the joint to prevent the metal from warping. The heat created from welding is enough to bend the metal. By tacking opposing corners, the warping's counterbalanced, thus keeping the metal straight. With the bottom frame pieced together, I'll now tack on the feet. To attach the feet to the base frame, I use magnets to hold the square tubing in place as I tack the corners. It's time to turn our attention to the shelf sides. The vertical supports are made from bed rails, so they need to be cut to length and the weld locations need to be cleaned. To keep the shelf supports in alignment, I made this positioning jig from scrap. You could use a piece of plywood cut to length or even a single piece of steel. Just make sure you measure off the same side of each support and use a good square. To start, I cut the vertical supports to 70 inches long. Then I position them on the table so they're even at the base and the same width as the bottom of the frame that was just made. Using the positioning jig, I locate the first shelf, tack it in place, and continue up the frame. I clean the frame with a wire wheel before tacking each shelf support into place. It's critical for their width and depth to be exactly the same for the assembly of the unit. Then it's rinse and repeat for more shelf sides. Now that the sides are welded and attached to the base frame, I'll show you how I attach the top strapping and the rear cross bracing. With the main construction of the upper case complete, it's time to focus on the base case. Now, the base case is made in the same exact manner, only the dimensions are 18 inches by 51 inches and 18 inches tall. The sides and middle partitions are going to support drawers and shelves, so they need to be made equal, just as the upper case sides were. I used the table fences to reference a 90-degree angle for the first side. Use a spacer for the first drawer support and connect the opposite side, checking for square before each weld. This is done for all 4 sides and middle partitions for a total of 8 assemblies. Then the base cases are assembled into the 2 individual units. Now let's focus a little bit on the detail work for the upper cases. I cut off the heads of some bolts, rusted them, and then drilled holes in the frames and welded the bolt heads to those frames. I had to weld in through the back where the holes were into the bolts. As you see, this adds a really nice detail to the piece. Now with all the major construction complete on the upper and the lower cases, it's time to work on the final details. I'll be cutting some sheet metal to cover up this corner here. It'll be matched to the width of the top and the sides, and it'll have a small radius connecting both. The top corner pieces on each side are made from 24 gauge sheet metal. This is too thin for my welder's settings to weld without burning through, so I'm using polyurethane glue to hold them in place. The front pieces are a heavier gauge sheet metal and receive the decorative bolt heads welded onto them. Then they were clamped into place, tacked on, and then shaped with a sanding disc. The bottoms of each case received a similar treatment. With all the detail work finally done, it's time to put a patina on the metal. I'm going to do that with a muriatic acid diluted with water solution. The solution will contain copper dissolved in the muriatic acid. That'll help put a nice colored rust on the metal. Using a hand pump sprayer, I applied the acid solution to the frames. The solution evaporates quickly, and over time it'll cause the steel to rust. So that does it for this part of the series of the welded bookcase build. The next part will cover all the woodwork, making the shelves, and making the drawers. To keep up with current projects, follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And for even more news and projects, go to spongeandworks.com. Thanks for watching.